A hero's homecoming. The quiet streets of Homestead blinked under a clear, star-strewn sky as General Marcus Taylor drove down the familiar tree-lined road he had missed every day for the past 2 years. Every house, every porch light, every shadow cast by the towering oaks along the curb felt like a balm to his soul, a reminder of why he had chosen this town to settle with his family. It was a town that had hardly changed while he was away, which made it even more of a treasure to him now. Tonight, he was no longer General Taylor, commander of troops, the man tasked with making decisions that held life or death weight. Tonight, he was simply Marcus, husband, father, neighbor. The grocery list from his wife Cynthia sat neatly folded in his pocket. It was a short list, just a few essentials: milk, bread, fresh vegetables, small things that felt almost surreal after 2 years of precision planning and strategic coordination for military operations overseas. Yet these small tasks felt monumental to him, part of the life he had longed to return to. As he drove through Main Street, the town was quiet, with only the hum of streetlights and a light breeze stirring leaves on the ground. He pulled into the parking lot of Benson's Grocers, the town's only 24-hour store, which was nearly empty this late at night. The neon sign buzzed softly, casting a green glow across the empty lot. After the steady roar of military bases and endless chatter of communication lines, this quiet, almost mundane scene felt like a luxury. Marcus took a moment, pausing in the car to breathe deeply, feeling the weight of his new reality settle comfortably over his shoulders. Inside, the store was brightly lit and smelled faintly of fresh produce and cleaning supplies. He picked up a basket and moved down the aisles with the same quiet discipline he used on the battlefield. There was a peace to this. No decisions that affected lives, no pressure, just selecting a carton of eggs, a loaf of bread, a bunch of bananas. As he walked down the aisle, a faint voice caught his attention. It was a young woman at the end of the aisle with a toddler who was pointing eagerly at a colorful display of cereal. The mother, though exhausted, was patiently explaining they couldn't buy it this time. Marcus smiled to himself, reminded of his own children when they were that age, when their greatest dreams were a box of brightly colored cereal, and their biggest frustrations were the moments they couldn't have it. Once he had everything on the list, Marcus headed to the checkout counter. The cashier, a young man with a polite but weary smile, rang up the groceries while Marcus swiped his card. As he gathered his bags and prepared to leave, he glanced back at the young mother and her child, nodding a quiet farewell. Back in his car, Marcus took a deep breath, his hand resting on the familiar contours of the steering wheel. He looked out at the empty parking lot, feeling grateful for the chance to be here, to enjoy the small freedoms and peace that civilian life brought. He was minutes from home now, minutes from wrapping his arms around Cynthia and letting her warmth ground him fully. As he began to back out of his spot, the tranquility of the night was interrupted by the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Confused, Marcus pulled back into the parking spot and turned off the engine, watching as a police cruiser slowly approached. His heart sank a little, but he reminded himself it was likely a simple matter, maybe a mistake, a routine check. After all, he had lived here for years and had never had an issue with the local police. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, his frame tall and imposing even in the dim glow of the parking lot lights. Marcus rolled down his window, mentally preparing to greet the officer. But before he could say a word, the officer's voice cut through the quiet night air. "What are you doing out here so late?" The officer's tone was sharp, not quite hostile, but far from friendly. Caught off guard, Marcus responded calmly, "Just picking up some groceries for my family. I live just a few streets over." The officer's eyes narrowed, his gaze drifting over Marcus in a way that felt unsettlingly scrutinizing. "This isn't the kind of place for loitering at this hour," he replied, his words pointed. "I don't think I've seen you around here." The insinuation was clear, and Marcus felt a surge of frustration rising within him. He fought to keep his tone even. "I've lived here for over a decade. "I'm just returning from a long deployment." The officer's eyes shifted, his gaze moving from Marcus's face to the grocery bags in the back seat, as if searching for a reason to challenge him further. Marcus remained still, maintaining his calm, though his fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Let's see some identification," the officer demanded. A flash of disbelief crossed Marcus's mind. He was a U.S. Army general, a man who had spent decades serving his country, and now he found himself having to prove his right to be in his own town. But he reached calmly into his pocket, producing his ID without a word. The officer took it, barely glancing at the name or title before handing it back with a curt nod. "I'll be watching out for you," the officer said, his voice cold and unyielding. Marcus took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of the officer's words. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, made to feel like a stranger in his own hometown. He watched the police cruiser as it drove off, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. The experience left him shaken, a jarring reminder that despite his service and sacrifices, there were still those who would look at him and see only a label that, in their eyes, diminished who he was. But Marcus wasn't one to let bitterness cloud his spirit. He took a deep breath, resolving to let the encounter remind him of his purpose, to live with integrity and strength, no matter the judgments or prejudices of others. As he finally started the engine and drove the last few blocks home, he was more determined than ever to be a role model for his children, to teach them by example that respect and resilience would always win over ignorance. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw the faint light of the living room lamp shining through the window. Cynthia was waiting for him, and he knew that within these walls, he was home in the truest sense. With one last look over his shoulder at the empty street, Marcus stepped out of the car and headed inside, where the real treasures of his life awaited him. Little did he know, tonight's experience was only the beginning of a journey that would test his resilience, and the resilience of those who looked up to him, in ways he had never expected. An unexpected confrontation. The first rays of dawn hadn't yet broken when General Marcus Taylor decided to take an early morning walk. After his unsettling encounter with the officer in the grocery store parking lot, he found himself restless, unable to fully relax despite being surrounded by the comforts of home. The interaction gnawed at him, bringing back a familiar, albeit uncomfortable, reminder that even his accomplishments and service couldn't shield him from certain prejudices. Leaving a quiet note for Cynthia, he slipped out into the early morning chill, hoping the cool air would help clear his mind. The streets of Homestead were still cloaked in darkness, with only a few streetlights casting soft pools of light onto the sidewalk. Marcus strolled down the empty streets, hands in his pockets, appreciating the solitude and the sound of his own footsteps on the pavement. As he walked, memories of his years in the service drifted through his mind. He had been trained to handle high-stakes situations, to make tough calls in moments of crisis. But somehow, facing prejudice here, in the place he had chosen to call home, felt different. It felt personal. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the police cruiser idling at the end of the block until he was nearly upon it. As he approached, the cruiser's headlights flared to life, and Marcus felt a momentary sense of unease. The officer inside was the same man he had encountered the night before. A knot tightened in his stomach as he watched the officer step out, his expression set in a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed suspicion. The officer, whose name tag read Officer Grant, approached with an air of authority that Marcus recognized all too well. Marcus was no stranger to authority. He embodied it, lived it every day of his career. Yet the way Officer Grant approached him was different, imbued with a subtle hostility that Marcus couldn't ignore. Early morning stroll. Officer Grant's voice was thick with condescension, his eyes studying Marcus as though trying to decipher a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Marcus offered a polite nod, unwilling to let himself be drawn into an argument. Just getting some air before the day starts. The officer's gaze didn't waver, and Marcus could sense the unspoken challenge behind those narrowed eyes. "Funny," Grant said, voice laced with suspicion. Don't see many folks around here out walking this early, and you're dressed a little too casual, aren't you? Marcus glanced down at his plain t-shirt and jogging pants, his lips pressing into a line. It was hard to hide the irritation simmering beneath his calm demeanor. This was his neighborhood, his home, and he had every right to be out here, dressed however he liked. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" Marcus asked, choosing his words carefully. Grant's eyes flashed, a spark of indignation igniting in his expression. "Funny you should ask. People around here have been reporting suspicious activity lately. Seems like an early morning walk could raise some questions." Marcus felt his patience waver. He reminded himself that losing his temper wouldn't help matters, but the insinuation stung. This wasn't just a casual conversation. This was an interrogation, a veiled accusation wrapped in the guise of routine questioning. "I've lived here for years, Officer Grant. There's nothing suspicious about walking in my own neighborhood," Marcus replied, keeping his tone steady but unyielding. Grant's face darkened, his gaze sharpening. "I know you think you're just another guy in this town, but folks around here like to know who's wandering around. You don't look like the average neighbor." Marcus took a slow breath, refusing to let himself be baited. "I am more than familiar with this neighborhood, officer, and I have every right to be here, just like anyone else." For a long moment, neither man moved. The silence between them grew thick, charged with unspoken tension. Marcus could see the doubt in Grant's eyes, mingling with a strange sort of defiance. This wasn't just about a man taking a walk. It was about more than that. A misunderstanding that ran deeper, fueled by assumptions and biases Marcus had encountered too many times before. Finally, Grant seemed to relent, though he looked anything but satisfied. "Just keep it in mind," he muttered, barely masking his frustration. "Some of us take our jobs seriously." Marcus fought to keep his tone neutral. "I'm sure you do." With a terse nod, Grant turned back toward his cruiser, though he paused before climbing inside, throwing one last look over his shoulder, as though he was sizing Marcus up once more. "Enjoy your morning." Marcus watched him go, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. It was impossible to ignore the underlying hostility in Grant's words, the sense that he had been assessed and dismissed as an outsider in a place he had considered his sanctuary. The quiet peace of his early morning walk had been shattered, replaced by the weight of yet another reminder that even here he was not truly free from judgment. As he continued down the street, Marcus's mind turned to his children, sleeping peacefully back at home. They were still young, blissfully unaware of the biases that colored the world. He wanted to protect that innocence, to shield them from the ugliness he had just experienced. But he knew he couldn't shelter them forever. After another few blocks, he took a seat on a park bench, facing the first soft glow of dawn on the horizon. His thoughts turned to his years in the military, the sacrifices he had made, the time spent away from his family, all in service of a country that didn't always acknowledge his worth. He had fought battles on foreign soil, but the one he faced now felt just as challenging, just as deeply rooted. In the quiet of the dawn, he reminded himself of the values he had always held: integrity, resilience, the unshakable belief in standing for what was right, even in the face of adversity. He knew this moment, this encounter, was just one small chapter in a larger story. He had faced greater obstacles and emerged stronger. This, too, he would overcome. Rising from the bench, Marcus continued his walk, head held high, determined to move forward. He had chosen this town for its tranquility, for the life he wanted to build with his family, and he wasn't about to let a few narrow-minded individuals strip that away from him. He would continue living his life with dignity, with strength, and with the quiet assurance that respect would always outweigh ignorance in the end. As he made his way back home, the sky lightening with the first signs of morning, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. There was a lesson in every experience, and today's lesson was clear. Prejudice might come in many forms, but the way forward was through resilience and a steadfast commitment to the values he held dear. And if this town wasn't ready to see him for who he was, then he would make sure they learned, by example, by the way he carried himself, and by the impact he would have in their lives. When he reached his front door, the neighborhood around him was beginning to stir, the gentle hum of early risers starting their days. With a final glance over his shoulder, Marcus stepped inside, closing the door on a night that had left a mark, but also strengthened his resolve. He would face whatever came next with the same unwavering spirit, and come what may, he would continue to walk through this town with his head held high, not just as Marcus Taylor, but as a man who believed that the path of respect and resilience would ultimately overcome any prejudice that dared to stand in his way. The power of resilience. A few days after his early morning encounter with Officer Grant, General Marcus Taylor had managed to slip back into the rhythm of home life. He'd taken his kids to their favorite ice cream shop, helped Cynthia in the garden, and even managed to make pancakes on Saturday morning, a family tradition he hadn't been around to enjoy in far too long. Life was settling into a peaceful routine, or so he thought. But the unsettling feeling from that encounter lingered. He couldn't shake the awareness that the quiet town he loved might harbor a side he hadn't fully seen until now. It wasn't just about one officer. It was the realization that some neighbors might see him not as General Taylor, respected community member, but as an outsider. That morning, he decided not to avoid it any longer. He laced up his shoes, kissed Cynthia goodbye, and headed into town to meet an old friend at the coffee shop. The cafe was small and cozy, filled with a few locals reading newspapers and students bent over laptops. Marcus ordered his coffee and joined his friend Sam, a retired teacher and one of the few people in town who knew about Marcus's experiences, both as a black man and a soldier. "Marcus," Sam greeted him warmly, slapping him on the back. "It's good to see you here again. How's retirement from the battlefield treating you?" Marcus chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm still adjusting, Sam. I faced more challenges than I expected. Even off the field, it seems." Sam's smile faltered. "Yeah, word's gotten around. People know you had a run-in with one of the local cops. But we both know that some things are hard to change, even here." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. He was quiet for a moment, glancing out the window, lost in thought. Maybe I expected too much, or maybe I just wanted things to be different, especially for my kids. But I can't let that stop me from being here, from trying to make this place feel like home. As they spoke, the bell over the cafe door jingled, and Marcus glanced up to see none other than Officer Grant himself walking in. Marcus felt a ripple of tension pass through the room as Grant made his way to the counter, eyes narrowed as he noticed Marcus. The officer ordered a coffee to go, but he lingered, clearly aware of Marcus's presence. Sam noticed as well, frowning slightly as he glanced at Marcus. "Looks like trouble found you again," Sam muttered, leaning back. Marcus met Sam's gaze, feeling a sense of weariness, but also a determination hardening within him. "I'm not going to hide," he replied quietly. "If he has something to say, he can say it." As if on cue, Grant approached their table, holding his coffee with a smug expression. "Well, General," he said, emphasizing the title with a mocking lilt. "I didn't expect to see you back so soon. Hadn't you gotten the memo that our town doesn't tolerate troublemakers?" Sam bristled, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "Troublemaker?" Marcus's voice was calm but firm. "I'm just here for coffee with a friend, Officer Grant. I didn't realize that warranted another interrogation." Grant's expression twisted with annoyance. "I have a duty to protect this town, and I don't appreciate newcomers thinking they're above the rules." "Newcomers?" Marcus repeated, keeping his tone steady, though his patience was fraying. "I've been a part of this community longer than you've been on the force. I'm not a stranger here." The cafe had fallen silent, the other patrons watching the exchange with a mix of unease and curiosity. Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes, the unspoken judgment in their stares. He reminded himself to stay calm, to stand his ground without losing his temper. Grant, seemingly unfazed by the attention, leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe where you come from, you can pull rank. But here, I don't care if you're a general or the president. Respect is earned, not demanded." Marcus held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Respect goes both ways, officer. I've spent my life serving this country, protecting communities like this one, including the people here who you're sworn to serve. I don't expect special treatment. I expect fair treatment." The silence thickened, and for a moment, Marcus thought the officer might escalate the situation. But then, as if sensing the collective disapproval of the onlookers, Grant's expression flickered. He seemed to realize that his words hadn't won him any sympathy. Muttering something under his breath, he turned and left the cafe, his coffee untouched on the counter. Marcus released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Sam placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, giving him a nod of support. "You handled that well, Marcus. Most people wouldn't have had the patience." Marcus offered a tight smile. Patience is part of the job description, even off the field. As they finished their coffee, Marcus could feel the eyes of the other patrons following him. Some looked away when he met their gaze, but others nodded with faint smiles, as if to acknowledge his resilience. He knew he had gained respect, not just by standing up to the officer, but by maintaining his composure under pressure. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. After saying goodbye to Sam, Marcus stepped back onto the sidewalk, feeling the crisp morning air wash over him. The town square was coming alive with the sounds of people opening shops, children laughing as they played nearby, and neighbors greeting one another. He stood there for a moment, breathing it all in, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He was done letting others define who he was in this community. He would not be the quiet soldier who faded into the background, nor the outsider who felt unwelcome in his own town. He would be present, a visible part of the community, not only for himself but for his children, who deserved a role model that stood tall despite prejudice. As he walked through town, he decided that it was time to engage more with his neighbors. He'd attend the local meetings, volunteer at community events, and make his presence known. If respect needed to be earned, then he would show them that he was more than worthy of it. When he returned home, Cynthia was in the kitchen, slicing apples for the kids' snacks. She looked up as he entered, catching the determined set of his jaw. "Everything all right?" she asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Marcus nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "Better than all right. I've decided I'm not going to let this go quietly, Cynthia. This is our home, and I'm going to make sure it's a place where we belong." She smiled softly, pride shining in her eyes. "That's the Marcus I know." Later that evening, as he sat at the dinner table with his family, Marcus felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt since his return. He knew that the road ahead might not be easy, that there would be challenges and moments where he would be forced to confront prejudice in ways he couldn't predict. But he also knew that he had the strength to face it, not just as a soldier but as a father, a husband, and a member of this community. His children looked up at him with bright eyes, asking questions about his day, about the life he had before he returned home. And as he answered, he made a silent promise to them. A promise to show them that dignity and resilience were worth fighting for, that the strength of one's character was more powerful than any prejudice they might face. In that moment, Marcus understood that his true mission was here, within the walls of his home and the streets of his town. And he was ready, more than ever, to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that his legacy would not be built solely on his military accomplishments, but on the life he lived and the respect he earned here, in the heart of the community he called home. Truth unveiled. The day after his run-in with Officer Grant at the cafe, Marcus decided it was time to take control of his narrative in the community. For too long, he'd allowed assumptions and misconceptions to linger. That evening, he put on his dress uniform, one he hadn't worn since returning stateside, and made his way to the local town hall, where a community meeting was taking place. He knew that showing up in his uniform would make a statement, one that spoke to his years of service and commitment to the values he held dear. The town hall was buzzing with the usual crowd: families, shop owners, elderly couples, and the occasional young adult who'd just become old enough to care about civic engagement. As Marcus entered, conversations quieted, and heads turned in his direction. The uniform, a deep navy blue with ribbons and medals that testified to decades of service, caught everyone's attention. It was as though his presence alone brought the weight of his experience and the dignity of his position into the room. The town council members sat at the front, facing the rows of folding chairs filled with residents. Marcus gave a respectful nod to each council member as he found an empty seat near the front. He noticed Officer Grant sitting in the back corner, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of surprise and barely concealed resentment. Marcus ignored him, focusing instead on the reason he had come: to make his presence felt and to show his community who he truly was. The council began with routine announcements, plans to repair the town's roads, updates on a new park, and discussions about school funding. But as they opened the floor for public comments, Marcus rose, adjusting his uniform slightly before speaking. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm but carrying a resonance that commanded attention. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marcus Taylor. I served as a general in the United States Army for more than 20 years, leading troops both overseas and at home. My family and I have lived here for over a decade, and this is a community we care about deeply." A murmur rippled through the room as he spoke, with some residents nodding in recognition and others exchanging surprised glances. Even those who didn't know him personally had heard whispers of his background. Now they saw the full picture. "I have been blessed to serve my country and to have the chance to lead others in the pursuit of justice, security, and freedom," he continued, meeting the gaze of each person who looked his way. "I am proud to live in this town and to raise my children here. But recent experiences have reminded me that not everyone sees me, or others who may look like me, as part of this community." The murmur grew louder as his words sank in, and Marcus felt a surge of strength coursed through him. He continued, "I understand that every community has its challenges, and that change doesn't happen overnight. But I am here tonight to remind you all that respect, fairness, and dignity should not be privileges. They should be rights, afforded to every resident of this town." Officer Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Marcus didn't acknowledge him directly. Instead, he focused on the community members in front of him, the people he was there to inspire and reach. "I know this is a town that prides itself on its values and its spirit of unity," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "But it is up to each of us to embody those values, to ensure that everyone feels safe and welcome here. That includes our young people, our elderly, and our veterans. I'm here to serve this community, not just in uniform, but as a neighbor, a father, and a friend." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room. The silence that followed was thick with reflection, as though each person present was being forced to examine their own beliefs and behaviors. Finally, a woman in the back raised her hand, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Mr. Taylor," she began, "I had no idea about your background. Thank you for your service, and thank you for reminding us what this town is supposed to stand for." Others nodded, murmuring their agreement, and Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was the connection he had hoped to forge, a chance to bridge the gap that ignorance and prejudice had created. As the meeting concluded, several people approached him, offering handshakes and words of gratitude. Some simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence and his message. A few of his neighbors, visibly moved by his speech, expressed their support, and others promised to reach out more in the future. It was a start, a small but meaningful step toward the unity he envisioned for his family and community. Just as Marcus was preparing to leave, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he found himself face to face with Officer Grant. The officer's expression was hard to read, a mixture of defensiveness and something resembling regret. Marcus regarded him with calm curiosity, giving him the chance to speak. "General Taylor," Grant began, his tone unusually subdued. I didn't realize who you were or what you'd done for this country. I just thought. He trailed off, as though unable to finish the thought. Marcus watched him, neither judging nor forgiving, simply listening. Grant shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. I was wrong, he admitted, finally meeting Marcus's gaze. I made assumptions, and they were unfounded. I know that now. Marcus considered his words carefully. He had spent a lifetime learning when to push, when to step back, and when to extend a hand. This was one of those moments where he could either confront or offer a chance for growth. We all make mistakes, Officer Grant, he replied, his voice measured. What matters is what we do to make things right. This community has an opportunity to be better, to be a place that welcomes everyone, no matter their background. Grant nodded, looking down as though ashamed. I'll think about that, he mumbled, before turning to leave, the weight of his own choices visibly bearing down on him. As Marcus watched him go, he felt a surge of hope. It wasn't a victory, not entirely, but it was progress. The truth of his story, his history, his service, his values, had finally been revealed, not as a way to command respect, but to earn understanding. He had planted a seed, a reminder that there was more to each person than met the eye, and that those willing to look deeper might find themselves changed for the better. That night, as he returned home, Marcus felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. He had entered that town hall not to demand respect, but to demonstrate his worth, and to inspire others to see the world, and each other, with clearer eyes. And while there was no guarantee that change would come quickly, he knew that he had made a difference. For his children, for his wife, and for everyone in his community who needed to see the example he set. Cynthia met him at the door, her face alight with pride, as she took his hands in hers. How did it go? She asked softly, her eyes searching his. He smiled, squeezing her hands gently. It went well. Better than I hoped, actually. I think people saw me tonight. Not just my uniform, but me. She nodded, her expression filled with love and admiration. That's all any of us can ask for. And you did it beautifully. As they sat together on the porch, watching the stars twinkle above, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew the journey wasn't over, that there would be more challenges, more moments when he'd have to stand firm. But tonight, he had taken a powerful step. The truth of who he was had been laid bare, and it was a truth that he could stand by, one that he hoped would lead his community toward a better future. For now, that was enough. And as he watched the quiet town around him, the homes and streets filled with people he was determined to reach, he felt at peace, ready for whatever lay ahead. A lesson in humility. The sun rose over Homestead, illuminating the town in a warm glow that felt like a fresh start. After the powerful meeting at the town hall, General Marcus Taylor awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. He had done more than just speak. He had opened a dialogue, sparked curiosity, and potentially changed perceptions in a way that might ripple through the community for years to come. But he also understood that real change didn't happen overnight. It required persistence, patience, and a willingness to engage, even with those who might resist. As he sipped his morning coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood come to life, he considered his next steps. There were still whispers of doubt and skepticism, and he knew he needed to engage more actively with his neighbors to foster understanding. He resolved to host a gathering in his backyard, an open invitation for the community to come together, share stories, and build bridges. Cynthia, he called, turning to his wife, who was busy preparing breakfast in the kitchen. What do you think about hosting a community barbecue this Saturday? Just a way for everyone to get to know each other better. Cynthia looked up, her face lighting up with enthusiasm. I think that's a wonderful idea. It's a great way to bring people together, especially after what happened at the town hall. Exactly. I want to show them that we can have a conversation without the tension, without the assumptions. Over the next few days, Marcus spread the word about the barbecue, personally inviting neighbors while sharing the news on social media platforms. He encouraged people to bring their favorite dishes, to come as they were, and to feel welcome. He wanted this to be a day of laughter, good food, and the shared humanity that often gets lost in the noise of everyday life. Saturday arrived, and the sun beamed down, promising perfect weather. Marcus and Cynthia spent the morning setting up the backyard, draping colorful tablecloths over picnic tables, arranging chairs, and firing up the grill. The familiar scents of burgers, hot dogs, and grilled vegetables filled the air, mingling with the laughter of their children as they played in the yard. As guests began to arrive, Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. He recognized some faces from the town hall, and while he was grateful for their presence, he was also aware that not everyone would be eager to engage. However, he pushed aside his worries and focused on welcoming each person with genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming." Marcus greeted each guest, offering handshakes and smiles. He noticed Officer Grant among the early arrivals, standing off to the side, looking somewhat uncomfortable. Their eyes met briefly, and Marcus offered a nod, silently acknowledging their previous encounters. As the afternoon unfolded, laughter echoed throughout the yard. Neighbors mingled, sharing stories and delicious food. Children raced around, their joy infectious, while adults chatted, exchanging anecdotes about life in Homestead. Marcus took a moment to step back, watching as the barriers that had once existed began to dissolve. Just then, a woman approached him, carrying a tray of cupcakes. "Marcus, right. I'm Angela. I just wanted to say how much I appreciated your speech the other night. It really opened my eyes." "Thank you, Angela. That means a lot to me," Marcus replied, genuinely touched by her words. "I believe we all have stories worth sharing." As the gathering continued, he moved through the crowd, engaging with as many people as possible. But he also made it a point to check in with Officer Grant. He found the officer standing near the grill, hesitating over the array of food. "Hey, Officer Grant," Marcus said, stepping beside him. "I'm glad you came." Grant looked surprised but nodded. "Thanks for inviting me. I didn't think I'd be welcome after, well, you know." "Everyone is welcome here," Marcus replied, trying to keep the conversation light. "It's all about breaking bread and sharing stories." "Right. Right," Grant said, forcing a smile. "I suppose I could use a break from everything." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of laughter and chatter surrounding them. Marcus sensed that Grant was struggling, not just with his place in this gathering, but with the implications of what had happened between them. "Listen," Marcus said, his voice earnest. "I'm not here to hold anything against you. We all make mistakes, and it's how we move forward that counts. I appreciate your willingness to come today." Grant met his gaze, the walls around him seeming to soften. "I've had a lot to think about since that night," he admitted, his voice lower than before. "I didn't realize how my words might affect others, and I want to do better. I'm sorry for how I treated you." Marcus felt a swell of hope. "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. That's how we learn and grow." Just then, a loud burst of laughter pulled their attention. A group of kids, including Marcus's children, had just splashed each other with a water balloon. The sound of joyful chaos was contagious, and Marcus couldn't help but chuckle. "Looks like the kids are having a blast," Grant said, glancing over at the commotion. "They sure are," Marcus replied, his heart lightening at the sight. "You know, it's easy to forget that we're all just people, navigating this life together. Sometimes it takes a little reminder to see beyond our differences." Officer Grant nodded thoughtfully, seeming to absorb Marcus's words. The tension that had previously marked their interactions began to dissipate, replaced by the shared experience of a community gathering. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the yard, Marcus gathered everyone around for a toast. "Thank you all for being here today," he called out, raising his glass. "I'm grateful for this community, for the opportunity to come together and share in the spirit of camaraderie. Here's to understanding, respect, and the chance to build a brighter future together. Cheers! The crowd echoed, glasses clinking, laughter erupting as everyone savored the moment. As the evening wore on, stories were shared, and barriers continued to break down. Marcus noticed that even Officer Grant was mingling more freely, laughing and talking with others. It was a small transformation, but one that filled him with hope. By the time the sun set and the stars began to twinkle overhead, the gathering had become a celebration of connection. Neighbors shared recipes, kids played games, and old friendships were rekindled. Marcus and Cynthia stood side by side, taking in the scene with contentment. "This was a great idea," Cynthia said, leaning against him. "I can see the difference it's making already." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment swell within him. "This is just the beginning. I want to keep these conversations going, keep building on this momentum. It's important for everyone to feel like they belong." As the last of the guests began to leave, Marcus felt a warm hand on his shoulder. It was Angela again, this time with a group of others who had stayed behind to help clean up. "Thank you for today, Marcus," she said earnestly. "You've reminded us all what it means to be a community." "That's what it's all about," he replied, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Together, we can make a difference." As they packed away the leftovers and tidied up the yard, Marcus found himself reflecting on the day's events. He had not only brought people together, he had also opened the door for healing, understanding, and humility. Each small interaction was a thread in the fabric of the community, weaving a stronger bond that would endure the challenges ahead. With the last of the trash bagged up and the grill turned off, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was not just a barbecue, it was a step toward redefining what it meant to belong. The laughter, the shared food, the conversations, all of it had created a space where assumptions could be challenged and understanding could flourish. As the stars twinkled brightly in the night sky, Marcus stood alongside Cynthia, watching their children play under the glow of the porch light. "Tonight was a success," he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "It was," she agreed, her eyes sparkling. "You've planted seeds of change, Marcus, and I believe they'll grow." With a renewed sense of purpose, Marcus nodded. He knew that while the road ahead might still have its challenges, today had shown him that community was built on connection, compassion, and the willingness to understand one another. And as he looked at his children, playing and laughing without a care in the world, he felt an overwhelming sense of hope. This was the legacy he wanted to leave, a legacy rooted in resilience, respect, and an unwavering belief that everyone, regardless of their background, deserved to belong. With the night embracing them, Marcus felt ready to face whatever came next, not just as a soldier but as a leader, a father, and a member of a community that was beginning to find its way toward unity and understanding. Forging new bonds. The days following the barbecue were filled with a palpable sense of change in the town of Homestead. People were talking, connecting, and engaging in ways that Marcus had not seen before. The seeds he had planted during the gathering were beginning to blossom into new friendships and understanding, and he could feel the positive shift in the atmosphere. However, he also understood that change required ongoing effort, and he was determined to nurture the newfound connections. As he settled into his routine, Marcus began to notice that people were more willing to approach him. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance were now stopping by for a casual chat, often expressing their gratitude for the barbecue and for his willingness to engage with the community. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This was the kind of neighborhood he had always envisioned. One sunny afternoon, Marcus was in his backyard working on his garden when he saw Officer Grant walking hesitantly down the street, looking unsure. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans, pausing to consider the officer's approach. He could tell Grant was still grappling with the implications of their earlier interactions, and he wanted to extend a hand to show that he was willing to move forward together. "Hey, Officer Grant," Marcus called out, smiling and waving him over. Grant looked taken aback, but he approached cautiously. "Hey, General," he replied, somewhat stiffly. "I wanted to stop by and see how you're doing after the barbecue." "I'm doing well," Marcus said, gesturing to the garden. "Just trying to grow a few veggies. How about you? How's work been?" Grant ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit Marcus recognized from their previous encounters. "It's been different, I guess. After everything that happened, I've been trying to reflect on my actions and how I approach my job." Marcus nodded, appreciating Grant's honesty. "That's a good start. Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward growth. You know, it's important to remember that we're all human. We all have our biases. The key is to recognize them and strive to be better." Grant's expression softened slightly as he listened. "Yeah, I've realized that. I've spoken to a few people in town who shared their experiences with me. It's opened my eyes." "That's great to hear," Marcus replied, feeling encouraged. Listening to others is such an important part of understanding. We can't assume we know someone's story just by looking at them. After a moment of silence, Grant looked at the garden and then back at Marcus. "Can I help with anything? I've never really gardened, but I'm willing to learn." Marcus chuckled, surprised by the offer. "Absolutely. I could use an extra pair of hands. And I promise, it's much easier than navigating the complexities of police work." As they worked side by side, digging in the soil and planting seeds, Marcus shared tips about gardening, while also weaving in lessons about leadership and community. He spoke about the importance of nurturing relationships, just like plants, requiring patience, attention, and care. "I see what you mean," Grant said, digging a little deeper with his shovel. "In a way, it's the same with people. You can't just throw them together and expect everything to grow perfectly." "Exactly," Marcus replied, smiling. "It takes time to cultivate trust and respect. But when you invest in those relationships, you can watch them flourish." As they worked, Marcus sensed that the officer was genuinely trying to change, to become someone who could serve his community better. They laughed and exchanged stories, and for the first time, Marcus felt like he was building a connection with Grant, not as an adversary, but as a colleague and neighbor. Later that week, Marcus received a call from the local community center, inviting him to speak at an upcoming event. They wanted to showcase stories of resilience, respect, and community building, and Marcus's recent efforts had made him a natural choice. He readily agreed, knowing it would provide him with another opportunity to share his journey and encourage dialogue among residents. On the day of the event, the community center buzzed with excitement as people gathered. Marcus arrived early, and the sight of familiar faces filled him with warmth. He exchanged greetings with neighbors, and it was heartening to see the diversity in attendance: young families, seniors, students, and even Officer Grant, who stood near the back, looking more confident than Marcus had ever seen him. The program began with local musicians performing, filling the air with uplifting melodies. When it was time for Marcus to speak, he stepped up to the podium, feeling a blend of nerves and anticipation. He took a deep breath and scanned the audience, his eyes settling on familiar faces. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I'm grateful to be here tonight, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and community members who are dedicated to making Homestead a better place for everyone." As he spoke about his experiences, the struggles he had faced both in the military and within the community, he wove in stories of hope, resilience, and the importance of understanding each other's perspectives. He shared anecdotes from his time in the service, emphasizing that real leadership was not just about authority, but about compassion, humility, and the willingness to listen. "I believe that we have the power to shape our community, to create an environment where every voice is heard and respected," Marcus said, gesturing to the audience. "But it starts with us. Each and every one of us must commit to breaking down barriers and building bridges." As he finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. Marcus felt a rush of gratitude and relief, knowing that his words had resonated with the crowd. Afterward, he mingled with the attendees, receiving positive feedback and sharing more stories. He noticed Officer Grant speaking to a group of young adults, explaining the importance of respectful interactions and listening to different perspectives. Marcus felt a swell of pride, seeing the officer take steps to embrace a more constructive role in the community. As the event came to a close, Marcus found himself surrounded by a group of neighbors who wanted to continue the conversation. They were eager to explore ways to further foster unity and understanding in Homestead. Marcus could feel a sense of camaraderie developing, a community willing to engage in difficult discussions, one that was ready to take ownership of its future. Later that evening, as Marcus returned home, he felt lighter than he had in months. He and Cynthia sat on the porch, recounting the highlights of the night. "You really made an impact tonight, Marcus," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "People are talking, and they're inspired." "I hope so," he replied, gazing out at the stars. "It's all about keeping the conversation going. I want to make sure we're creating a space where everyone feels like they belong, where we can share our stories and learn from one another." As they sat together in the stillness of the night, Marcus reflected on the journey he had taken since returning home. He had faced challenges, not just from external forces, but also within himself. He had fought against prejudice and misunderstanding, but he had also learned the power of resilience, dialogue, and connection. Over the next few weeks, the momentum continued. Marcus became actively involved in community events, promoting discussions about race, respect, and understanding. He encouraged neighbors to share their experiences, fostering an environment of openness and learning. The changes he had hoped for were beginning to materialize, a community moving toward unity. One Saturday morning, as Marcus and Cynthia took their children to the local park, they were greeted with smiles and waves from neighbors. Children played together, and laughter filled the air. He felt a warmth in his heart as he watched his kids interact with others, their innocence allowing them to forge friendships without the barriers that adults sometimes imposed. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining brightly as families gathered for a picnic. Marcus took a moment to step aside, watching the interactions unfold. It was in these moments that he found the true essence of community, people connecting, learning, and growing together. Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself sitting on a park bench, enjoying the laughter of children playing in the distance. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Officer Grant approaching, a warm smile on his face. "Hey, General," Grant said, sitting beside him. "I wanted to thank you for everything. Since that night at the barbecue and your speech, I've been trying to do better, not just as an officer, but as a member of this community." "I appreciate that, Grant," Marcus replied, genuinely touched. "It takes courage to change, and I'm glad to see you taking those steps. Honestly, I didn't realize how disconnected I had become from the people I serve. I'm learning that we need to build relationships, not just enforce the law," Grant admitted, looking out at the park. "It's about understanding the people behind the badges and uniforms." Marcus nodded, feeling hopeful for the future. "Exactly. When we take the time to listen and understand one another, we can create a community that thrives on respect and empathy. It's an ongoing journey, but it's one worth taking." As they sat together, watching the families enjoy their day, Marcus felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished, both as individuals and as a community. The lessons learned, the bonds formed, and the understanding gained were invaluable, a testament to the strength of resilience and compassion. In that moment, surrounded by laughter and connection, Marcus understood that this was the legacy he wanted to leave, a legacy rooted in respect, understanding, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved to be heard and valued. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the park, Marcus knew that the journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them, not just for himself, but for his family, his neighbors, and the community he cherished. Together, they would continue to build a future that honored their differences and celebrated their shared humanity. And as he stood up to join his family, Marcus felt a profound sense of hope and determination for the path ahead, a path paved with understanding, compassion, and the power of community.